For most of human history, survival was synonymous with attacking and defending. Every tool developed during this long process was first intended to provide an advantage against nature, then against rival human communities. The first weapons were nothing more than the simple superiority offered by the sharp edge of a stone. But as time went on, war became a means not just of survival, but of establishing power. Weapons were no longer made to protect the body, but to shape the social order. At the center of this transformation was one of the first technologies designed solely for killing, the sword. Early battles were mostly fought with spears and clubs because distance meant safety. The farther you kept the enemy, the higher your chance of survival. The bow and arrow was a revolution that turned the hunter into a sniper. Despite this, the invention of a close contact tool like the sword seems illogical at first glance. This contradiction is the key to understanding the sword. It doesn't aim to kill from a distance, but to establish close quarters dominance. That's why it created status from the moment it existed. The person carrying a sword was saying, "I do not run from fear," and this message carried political power. The anatomy of the human body gave birth to the idea of the sword. The swinging axis of the arm, the agility of the wrist, and the power of the shoulder muscles made a long blade held in hand suitable for both cutting and thrusting. In this respect, the sword is the first example of a biomechanical weapon in harmony with the body. A spear requires two hands and has limited maneuverability. With a sword, a person turns their own body into a weapon. This also changed the psychology of combat. Warriors who used swords became a special class in society. Another factor that triggered the birth of a sword was the narrowing of battlefields with the beginning of settled life. Castle sieges, street fights, enclosed geometries. Spear formations were still effective, but combat was getting compressed into shorter distances. This required a fast, agile weapon that highlighted individual skill. The sword evolved from a tactical sidearm to a frontline weapon. However, the idea of the sword couldn't be realized with stone. The structure of stone doesn't offer durability in a long, thin form. Therefore, the emergence of the sword is parallel to the birth of metallurgy. Coppersmithing was the first step on this journey. Copper is easy to shape, but soft. It was kept short to prevent breaking. That's why early copper blades were often ceremonial. Still, people were quick to see the cutting advantage this new material offered. Thus, the idea of extending the blade became possible for the first time. The revolutionary move came with arsenical bronze. Alloying copper with arsenic significantly increased its hardness. Now the blade could be longer. Archaeological findings proved that blade-sword hybrids emerged around Mesopotamia and Anatolia in the late 4th millennium BC. These first examples were not yet full swords, but the mental evolution of the design had begun. The distinction between the hilt and blade became clear. Central reinforcing ridges were added, and the balance point was optimized for hand movement. The sword's early role was more about representing power than being a tool of war. The bronze weapons found in the tombs of chiefs are a testament to this. Arsenical bronze blades excavated from the royal tombs of symbolized that the owner's authority in life continued after death. In other words, the sword was a political object from the very beginning. For someone to have a sword meant they had a say over a community. During this period, it wasn't just the material that limited the use of swords. Production required expertise. Making a spearhead was much easier than forging a long, cutting blade. Sword mastery created a separate class of craftsmen in society. The weapon's high cost turned it into a prestige accessory even in times of peace. Nevertheless, its presence on the battlefield gradually expanded. Short bronze swords became the decisive tool in moments when a spear broke or the enemy line dissolved. This use foreshadowed the central role the sword would later assume. As city-states grew, so did the scale of warfare. Now, not just tribes, but armies faced each other. Obedience, discipline, and leadership decisions determined the fate of military technologies. In this context, the sword can be defined as a leadership weapon. A sword raised by a commander towards the opposing line served as a signal to start, an order to gather, or the authority to execute. Thus, the sword became both a tool of death and a tool of communication. Towards the end of the Bronze Age, all these changes made experiments with long blades commonplace. Humanity now knew that a stronger material was needed to use the sword to its full potential. But the collapse of trade networks and the depletion of tin resources made bronze expensive and inaccessible. This economic rupture changed the course of history. A new material had to take the stage. The era that would determine the true destiny of the sword was about to begin. Before iron entered the scene, the material that defined the sword's destiny was bronze. This alloy, obtained by mixing copper with arsenic or later tin, offered humanity-controlled sharpness and durability for the first time. The rise of bronze played a critical role in transforming the sword into not just a technical tool, but a social object of power. The development of merchant networks from the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC made bronze accessible. Although tin had to be transported from distant lands, the military advantage gained justified the cost. Thus, bronze weapon production became a strategic investment for city-states. The first true sword examples appeared in the range of 35 to 60 centimeters. They weren't long yet, but the design decisions were clear. Balanced weight distribution, hilt reinforcement, and preventing impact fractures with a central ridge. This early form of the sword fell into the hands of the military elite in Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, and Anatolia. For instance, bronze swords with hilts decorated with precious stones were discovered in tombs around Nineveh and Mari. These findings tell us that the person carrying a sword held the authority to kill. The weapon was more than a tool of war. It became the physical expression of power. Throughout the Bronze Age, the sword continued to function as a shock weapon, waiting behind spear formations. When the line of battle collapsed and spearheads were out of action, close combat began. In those critical few seconds, the sword determined who would survive. This defined the sword as the weapon of the final blow. The strike that declared victory in battle often came from a sword. During this period, metallurgy was intertwined not only with the needs of war, but also with rituals. Hittite texts associate the king's girding of a sword upon ascending the throne with the command of the gods. In Egypt, depictions of pharaohs show the sword as a symbol of protecting order against the forces of chaos. The sword was positioned as the guarantor of a spiritual concept, the earthly order. This further increased the weapon's social weight. Then, towards the end of the Bronze Age, a major rupture occurred. Trade networks collapsed. Tin became scarce. The system that sustained civilizations entered a great collapse around 1200 BC. Bronze became a luxury. It was difficult even to find the metal needed to make a sword. This crisis forced weapon makers to look for a different option: raw iron. Iron's advantage was far more significant than bronze's. It was found everywhere. Hardening techniques were still rudimentary, but the abundance of the raw material would allow the sword to become the weapon not just of elites, but of large armies. The ornate and ceremonial appearance of bronze swords began to recede in the face of iron's practical, war-focused nature. The sword was about to become not just a symbol of authority, but one of the technical backbones of mass warfare. This transition triggered a domino effect that would completely change the history of war. Now the question to be answered is, how did the crisis that brought down civilizations turn the sword into a global standard of war? The details of this transformation cannot be understood without comprehending the new anatomy of the Iron Age sword. Thanks for joining us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. See you next time.